Welcome to today's Schwartz Lecture. The Schwartz Lecture was established in 1974 in honor of Judge Ulysses S. Schwartz. Its purpose is to bring distinguished lawyers, judges from a range of different walks of life, the academy, from journalism, from government, to share their experiences and perspectives with our faculty and students. Judge Schwartz was a longtime supporter of the university and of the law school. He began his career in 1910 as a special assistant prosecutor here in the city of Chicago, and he ended his career as a member of the Illinois Supreme Court in 1974. The following year, his friends and family established this lecture. His son, John Schwartz, is a graduate of this law school and became a federal bankruptcy judge here in the Northern District of Illinois, including serving from 1978 to 1989 as its chief judge. And today we're thrilled to welcome Joan Biskupic, our lecturer today. She is CNN's legal analyst. She is an accomplished journalist who has covered the Supreme Court for more than 30 years. She has an undergraduate degree from Marquette, a master's in English from the University of Oklahoma, and a JD from Georgetown. She has held a number of prominent positions, reporting on legal affairs at USA Today, editor-in-charge of legal affairs at Reuters, a reporter covering the Supreme Court at the Washington Post, and now as legal affairs analyst at CNN. She is author of several books, including biographies of Justices Sandra Day OConnor, Antonin Scalia, Sotomayor, and most recently, Chief Justice John Roberts. Her latest book, The Chief, The Life and Turbulent Times of John Roberts, has received in tremendous praise, and praise for its meticulous reporting, its compelling storytelling, and its deep knowledge of the law and of the court's inner workings. We're pleased to have her today, and we're also pleased to guide our discussion today, Professor Jeffrey Stone. Professor Stone is the Edward Levy Distinguished Service Professor. He is, of course, a graduate of our law school. He clerked for Justice Brennan. He is a former dean of the law school and former provost of the university, an influential constitutional law scholar, and a longtime editor of the Supreme Court Review. Please join me in welcoming today's Schwartz lecturer, Joan Biskupic.
So, Joan, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
How did it happen that you wound up spending your time writing these biographies of Supreme Court justices?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Dean. Can you hear me?
It's the
Oh, yeah, the part about turn it on. So they always tell you not to turn it on until you're really ready. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Yes. That way you didn't pick up all the little quiet things we were talking about before. But that was the important part. And the most important part is thank you very much for having me. As Jeff knows, I grew up on the South Side and spent a lot of time in the Chicago area before I went off to school, and have come to visit many times and just love Hyde Park. So happy to be here. I got interested in biographies because I wanted to know more about what made these justices who they are, what their early influences were, their families. My very first one was Sandra Day OConnor. And because I had covered politics along the way in my journalistic career and the law, I was interested in the fact that this was a state legislator, a very successful state legislator. Many people don't know that Sandra Day OConnor was the first female state majority leader nationwide. And then she came to the Supreme Court, in my mind, knowing how to count votes. So I got very interested in Sandra Day OConnor as someone who was not just the first woman on the Supreme Court, but a real politician on the court. And then in the process of doing that research, I love archives, and I spent a lot of time at the Reagan archives in Simi Valley researching Justice O'Connor's nomination, and that got me deeper into Antonin Scalia's papers there with looking at the Reagan choice, and I thought he was much more the manifestation of the Reagan agenda. So that's how I pivoted to Justice Scalia. And so once you get into it, once you start learning about these people's lives, your appetite becomes quite whetted, and you just can't stop.
So what surprised you most about Justice Sandra Day OConnor in the course of writing this biography of her?
Well, actually, it's a Brennan connection, and I'm glad the dean referred to your clerkship for William Brennan. Back in 1993, when I was at the Washington Post, a couple colleagues and I delved into the newly opened papers of Thurgood Marshall. And I don't think many people in this room would have remembered what happened over that ordeal, although you, Jeff, might remember. Thurgood Marshall gave his papers to the Library of Congress without his colleagues knowing about it. But we found out, and I was working with Bob Woodward, a man by the name of Ben Weiser, who's now at the New York Times, and an editor of mine, Fred Barbash. And we found out about these papers being opened before anybody else did. And so we went and delved through all of these papers, and in May 1993, did a project showing the secrets of the Supreme Court through the eyes of Thurgood Marshall's secret papers. And it was a wonderful series to be part of, but there was this one document I found that planted the seed of Sandra Day OConnor, and a very surprising seed that got me interested in her. And it was a letter that William Brennan had sent to Thurgood Marshall in a criminal defense case. And Brennan was explaining to his very good friend Thurgood Marshall why he had bailed on him. And he said, Sandra forced my hand by threatening to lead the revolution. And I thought, Sandra Day OConnor threatened this master of 5 votes? I mean, that was what, as most of you know, I'm sure, Bill Brennan's reputation for almost all of his tenure, that he could pull 5 votes out of a hat, even when it became a much more conservative court. And he's saying that Sandra Day OConnor forced his hand, and that got me really interested in her. And I was able to parlay the research that I had done in the Marshall papers into something bigger. And what surprised me was, how she was really operating. Mm-hmm. Just yesterday in the class I was in, First Amendment class, we were talking about Dun & Bradstreet versus Greenmoss. And in that case, if I'm remembering right, and I didn't go back and double check, but I remember, I'm almost positive it was that case where Justice O'Connor sends a note to Lewis Powell, which I found in the Powell archives down in Lexington, Virginia, that said, if I get with Byron early enough, I think we can move him over. Byron being Byron White. Now, Byron White doesn't sign what was the plurality opinion there, but I kind of remember finding those sorts of documents and being surprised at how much maneuvering behind the scenes Justice O'Connor was doing that, most of you in this room probably wouldn't have suspected.
So O'Connor was the first woman justice to serve on the Supreme Court. How did that play out in practice? I mean, what was it like for her? To what extent was she treated differently because she was the first woman? Was it an issue?
Oh, yeah, it completely was. She came on in 1981, and the reason she was selected was actually because she was a woman. Ronald Reagan, trailing a bit in the polls in fall of 1980, as he's running against Jimmy Carter, decides to pledge that he would put the first woman on the Supreme Court. So, and it helped him a little bit, and Jimmy Carter said something like, well, everyone knew I was going to appoint a woman, but it was kind of like, Ronald Reagan saying this was potentially a big deal, but there were a lot of other reasons why Reagan won in November of 1980. But so what happens is in March, I love finding out this chronology. March 26th, which happens to be Sandra Day OConnor's birthday, March 26th of 1981, Potter Stewart confides in William Friend Smith, then the Attorney General, that he's going to be stepping down. This is March 26th of 1981. 4 or 5 days later is when Reagan was shot. So Reagan doesn't know for actually a couple weeks that he's about to have this momentous first nomination to the Supreme Court, which is, a very big deal to be just a few months into your presidency and suddenly have this opening. And of course he did then look for women. And Sandra Day OConnor, she was only a state intermediate court judge at the time. She was on an appeals court in Arizona, but boy, was that woman connected. So not only did she had developed a friendship with Chief Justice Warren Burger, she had plenty of people she had been Nixon's campaign manager in Arizona in 1972, which people, that doesn't seem like that would have been possible, but it was. So she was really connected and Ken Starr, gosh, all these names that we know now. Ken Starr was one of the 2 Reagan aides who went out to Arizona to interview her. And he said to me, I can't believe I'm going to Arizona for this intermediate state court judge. What's she going to know? But that woman was so prepared. She had, of course, boned up because she was all about the homework. And plus, she made him a salmon salad. So she did all these things that would reinforce the idea that I am one of the good women, but I'm also a smart woman. And then when she, Reagan on the spot, when he interviewed her in the Oval Office, they could, she could talk about the law, but then they could talk horses, and he was sold.
You might say a word about O'Connor's relationship with William Rehnquist.
Oh, yes. Well, now we know. I knew that they had been friends. I knew that they had dated. But when I did my book, I did not have a lot of her personal correspondence. I had all her legislative correspondence in Arizona, which was really helpful. And then I had her correspondence with other justices, but I didn't have her diaries, which Evan Thomas, who, my book came out in 2005, and Evan Thomas just did a recent biography of her, and he had access to her diaries and more personal correspondence. And William Rehnquist had actually proposed marriage in a letter to her, so I hadn't realized that. But they both...
This is when they were in college.
Yes, right. They go to Stanford together. And... But they both ended up in very happy marriages and then socialized together in Phoenix, playing charades and going on picnics and doing all these things with their families. So it was, that's kind of another quirk of history, because if she had said yes, she would have never been on the Supreme Court.
Right.
Yeah.
And she broke his heart when he proposed.
Right.
And she said, no thanks.
Yes, right. She had already met John OConnor, whom she married, was also a law student there. And
right.
He turned her head a little bit further than Bill Rehnquist.
So what about Justice Antonin Scalia, who was on the faculty here for a number of years? What's interesting about him from your perspective?
Well, I love to tell the story about, well, first of all, just in terms of family dynamics, his father had come over from Sicily knowing no English when he arrived, ends up getting a PhD at Columbia, becomes quite an accomplished professor of Romance languages, a collector of lyrics, a textualist himself, and as we all know, Justice Scalia became a textualist of the law. And so he had a very interesting family background, Italian background. His mother was one of 7 children. His father was one of just 2. But he was an only child, and not only was he an only child, he was the only child of his generation. None of his aunts and uncles had had children. So thinking of Justice Scalia's personality and thinking of him being an only child and an only child of his generation was quite meaningful. And I like to tell the story of when I was able to get him to really break down and sit for 12 on-the-record recorded interviews. And it came, I think I told you, after this wedding that I ran into him at. The justices, I do these books as a journalist. I don't do them as authorized biographies. I do them as a journalist. And, you have to kind of convince a justice to sit for interviews. And it always works out. So when they initially start out saying, I will not talk to you. You can talk to my colleagues, you can talk to my friends, you can talk to family, but I will not talk to you. I usually say, okay. Because I know you will talk. And with Justice Scalia, I love to tell the story of how he, and we're not talking about any kind of sort of mild-mannered individual who didn't know his own self. So he was saying, no, I don't want to talk to you at all. But I ran into him at a wedding of a mutual friend. I don't travel in those kinds of circles, but I happened to be at this wedding of a former clerk of his and a woman who I knew. And he comes up to me, and I'm with my husband, and everybody's drinking. You don't look as formidable at a wedding. And he says, well, what do you think you're finding out so far? And I say, I've been going through the archives in Trenton, immigration records. That's where his family had settled. And I've also gone through all the New York Times articles that referred to your father. And I said, do you know the first time that your father, as accomplished as he became, was mentioned in the New York Times? And he said, no. And I said, it was in 1935 when he won a fellowship to study Romance languages from Columbia back in Florence and Rome. And I thought, the father had gone on to be this very important scholar, and I thought that was an interesting thing I had said about finding this fellowship. And he said, yes, but did you know I was conceived on that fellowship? And I said, no amount of research would have gotten me that little factoid. So and then this was a Saturday wedding, and the following Monday he called me up and he said, what else have you found out? And that was the start of, as I say, a very beautiful relationship. And he loved, what I was able to find out about all his family. And then he didn't like everything. He didn't like much of what ended up in the book, but he liked it enough that he kept talking to me. And when the American Bar Association did a salute in conjunction with the Supreme Court, in the Great Hall of the court, they used a lot of material from the book. So I was, he liked it enough that upon his death, they didn't think it was going to hurt him to, to cite it.
Do you remember when you called me when you were working on the book about Scalia?
I do, because that was we had that kind of long-running controversy involving you and the justice. But before he passed, you made your peace, right?
Yeah, because of you.
Oh, okay. Well, bringing people together, that's it.
Yes. No, I had written an op-ed in, I think it was the New York Times, I don't remember,
yes,
criticizing the court for a decision in the abortion case, in which they had, in a 5-4 decision, essentially overruled a prior decision simply because Justice Alito had replaced Justice O'Connor, who'd been in the majority in the prior case, and then when Alito joined the court, they basically flipped. And all 5 justices in the majority were Catholic. And so I wrote this op-ed, which was called Our Catholic Justices, and talked about the fact of I wondered whether they had been as careful in separating their religious views from their responsibilities as justices. And I mentioned that I clerked for Justice Brennan the year Roe v. Wade was decided, and I'd watched him struggle with trying to reconcile his religious views as a Catholic with his views as a justice. And so I was naive about how provocative and controversial this would be, I have to say. And Scalia was furious about this. And I kept hearing from people that, he said, I'll never come back to the law school again as long as stones on the faculty.
Right.
And Joan then called me, because you had interviewed him.
Yes, and he was, and that's him. He sits sitting behind this huge desk, and I'm never going to set foot on the campus, and I probably won't take their clerks, and I'm just going to stomp my feet until I drop dead, kind of thing, because he had that way about him, which made him, again, a very colorful figure. And
right.
I called you to tell you to get your response for the book.
Right, and so the reason your book was responsible for that being put behind us is that. When that happened, the issue became so public, and Scalia's, because you described his response when you asked him about it in your interview, and it became embarrassing to Scalia. And I then heard from some mutual friends that Scalia would really be open to an apology on my part. So I crafted a letter in which I said I was very sorry that he was upset by the op-ed. And he called me immediately thereafter and said, Jeff, as a good Catholic, I forgive you. And that put it aside.
Well, it was, to the credit of both of you that you would do it, and that he would, he it was interesting, his personality. There was one day where I showed up, and he had been sitting for tape-recorded interviews. And fortunately, I got a tip from someone in his chambers that he suddenly was going to say to me, I don't want to have any of these on the record. Which was a very useful thing to know is about to happen to you, because you're thinking, I can't live with this. I can't have this happen. I have to, I'm not going to start running material by him after we've gone so far down the road. So it gave me time to think about it. But and then when I got into his chambers, he said, I've decided, Joan, I don't think I should talk on the record. You just come to me and tell me what you want to use. And I said, no. We can't do it this way. We've already, the horse is out of the barn. We've already done this way. We just can't. And he pushed back, and then I pushed back, and then he said, okay. But what I always said about him was that I could talk to him like that. Justice O'Connor, I wouldn't even be alive right now if I had tried that on her. She was so tough. She was, and everyone used to say to me, oh, Scalia just seems like he would be so much harsher and tougher to deal with. No, he was, he could back down, as he obviously did with you. But Justice O'Connor, boy, man, she didn't become the first woman justice for nothing. She was very determined.
So what about Justice Sotomayor? Can you tell us about her?
Sure. Now, that book was not a straight biography the way the others were, because she was, as I was deciding I wanted to write about our first Latina justice, I knew that she had her own book in the works. So I made it more of a political history, which was frankly, a lot of fun to do as a journalist, because as you're reporting on who's up, who's down, who are presidents looking for in their nominees, how do these people emerge? How do, out of all the very smart people sitting in this room, going to law school, bound for clerkships of various sorts, bound for important government jobs, bound for great scholarship, who emerges in the pile to become a justice? And that's what this tale was about. How was she the first Hispanic justice? How was it not Miguel Estrada during the George W. Bush administration? How was it not Jose Cabranes during the Clinton administration? You know, why was it her? And I had covered a lot of those nomination fights, and what was intriguing about following her trajectory was seeing how many times along the way administrations said, oh, we're looking at all these Hispanics, when they really weren't. You know, it wasn't until, obviously, President Obama in 2009 chose her. And so that was kind of looking at her as someone who was very much of an actor in her own journey. Unlike David Souter, who we both know who he succeeded, William Brennan, kind of was, you know, plucked there by pals from New Hampshire who said, let's make it him. Whereas Sonia Sotomayor just very much helped herself get on the district court, recommended by Moynihan, Senator Moynihan, but nominated by George H.W. Bush, and then, you know, just what happened along the way. And it was during that episode that she first met John Roberts, who was a deputy solicitor general at the time and had a hand in actually not so much encouraging her nomination at first.
What about her role on the court itself? I mean, how well does she function on the court with the other justices? And do you have a sense of whether she's pleased with her role on the court?
I think she's very pleased. I think she breaks away from the nine. One thing that I was told as I was doing my reporting both on her and then, you know, with the subsequent appointment of Elena Kagan in 2010 is that Justice Sotomayor sees herself often as one justice working on her own idea of what the law should be, what her mission should be, and probably many people in this room have seen her speak about her books. She's very active outside of the court. She's very active as a single justice, making her wishes known. Just on Monday, she dissented alone, if I'm remembering right, in one of the orders. Whereas Justice Kagan is very aware of herself as one of nine, negotiating with the nine, trying to broker compromises, trying to find the middle ground. So I think they're both very satisfied with what their individual roles are, but Justice Sotomayor will probably be remembered when the time comes down the line for someone who made her mark on the court, but also very much outside the court. She talks about wanting to reach as many children as she can. You know, her most recent book is a book for children called Just to Ask, which is about her struggle with diabetes. So she sees herself in a role that is a much broader presence than most of the other justices do.
So, John Roberts, why don't you tell us a little bit about his personal background? Sure.
And I should tell you, you know, just one thing I like to remind folks about is, you know, we've had 45 presidents to date, but only 17 chief justices. So that tells you the magnitude of his role in our lives. And, you know, he's been on the court since 2005, so we're just in his 14th year. And he's for all appearances, seems healthy and will be going on for at least twice that amount of time. He's only 64 years old. And he grew up in northern Indiana, not too far from here. You know, family would fly into Midway often enough. And in a beach community called Long Beach that used to be a vacation area for wealthy Chicagoans. And his father was very much a product of the steel industry when steel was king, you know, and so that was a very hierarchical world that his father was part of. And I liken that in the book a lot to, you know, the hierarchical world of the federal judiciary. But his parents, in some ways, married across the tracks. His father, John Glover Roberts Sr., came from an English-Irish family that settled in the Pennsylvania area, mining coal country and then steel country back in the mid-1800s. And then his mother, her family names were Podrasky and Gumska. Nobody was really quite sure how to pronounce the other family name in that family, but it was Czech. You know, the borders were always shifting with the Hungarian Empire, but, you know, essentially Slovakian. They came about 20, 30 years later to this region of Pennsylvania, and were not as well off. They weren't as educated. They struggled much more with more menial jobs, you know, as a whole. So the father, who was the youngest of 10 children, marries Rosemary, his mother, and they essentially said, and the mother never went to college, and that was her lifelong regret. You know, anybody in the family who talked about his mother talked about her regret of never going to college, and in many ways living out some of her dreams through her only son. He was the only boy in a family of 4. He had 3 sisters, 1 older, 2 younger. He was, as anybody could observe, even now in his life, very, very smart. And I love reading this letter. I brought it with me because I will often start more formal speeches with a letter that he wrote on December 22nd, 1968, when he was an 8th grader in a parochial school. You know, he grew up in an area that was a little better off than what you would, you know, experience in many of the in Chicagoland here, but you know, he had a lot of the traditional upbringing that many Chicagoans had. You know, went to a parochial school attached to a church, and he was essentially expected to go to a parochial high school. You know, back then it was all boys or all girls, but he had the good fortune of around the time that he was applying to college, high school, pardon me, a very fancy Catholic boarding school had opened up. And, you know, in the model of East Coast elite schools. And he knew he wanted to go to that. And he wrote a letter to the headmaster that says the following: "Dear Mr. Moore," and he's only 13 at the time, "the main reason I would like to attend La Lumiere School is to get a better education. I've always wanted to stay ahead of the crowd, and I feel that the competition at La Lumiere will force me to work as hard as I can. At an ordinary high school, it would probably be easy to stay ahead. I realize that going to La Lumiere will mean a lot of study and hard work, but I feel confident that these labors will pay off in large amounts when it comes time to apply for admission to college. I'm sure that by attending and doing my best at La Lumiere, I will assure myself of a fine future." And then he closes, "I won't be content to get a good job by getting a good education. I want to get the best job by getting the best education. Sincerely yours, John Roberts, Jr." Now, of course, he was accepted. He becomes #1 in his class. And again, you know, this isn't the kind of education that your average Midwestern college Catholic boy would get. But he was able to get this. He then goes to Harvard, does Harvard College in 3 years, goes to Harvard Law School, wins, you know, all sorts of honors along the way during his time at Harvard. But he bristled. He did not like Cambridge. He, you know, we're still in the sort of 60s fallout in the early 70s, didn't like the lingering anti-war protests, pretty much, you know, stuck to his studies and did those very, very well, and worked so hard that lots of his pals remember him either clutching a bottle of Pepto-Bismol or sometimes just being exhausted from study. So he obviously is super smart, and much of it came naturally, but he was not going to take anything for granted.
And how did he go from there to being on the Supreme Court? Okay,
so he graduates from Harvard Law School. He was managing editor of the Law Review, and he is tapped for a clerkship with Henry Friendly, who was on the Second Circuit, and many people regarded Judge Henry Friendly as the greatest appeals court judge of his era. Merrick Garland had a name familiar to probably everyone in this room, had that clerkship 2 years earlier and had a little bit of a hand in helping him to that spot. And then once he got with Henry Friendly, he was applying to clerkships at the Supreme Court, and it was a very strong match between him and Bill Rehnquist. Mm-hmm. And as you know, Jeff, I paint in this book this kind of dichotomy that the chief always feels between the model of Henry Friendly, who was quite a judge's judge, you know, much more of a neutral professional jurist, versus William Rehnquist, super smart, first in his class at Stanford, but very ideologically driven. And, you know, where does John Roberts fall? And right after clerking for William Rehnquist, he opts for the more ideological route, gets a job in the Reagan administration, coincidentally recommended by William Rehnquist to Ken Starr, who at the time was working as chief of staff to the Attorney General under Reagan. So John Roberts works first in the Justice Department and then in the White House counsel's office, makes some deep, deep pals there. In fact, he is still very close to Fred Fielding, who was White House counsel under Ronald Reagan, and all those good friends from that group. They still get together. They were together for Fred Fielding's 80th birthday last spring. And so he gets this core group of people, and in some ways he replicates this boarding school life. You know, he's got these core men who are loyal to him, and he's loyal to them. And I worked very hard to get those people to talk as I went along. And then, so he works for Reagan. Then he works in the H.W. Bush administration as Deputy Solicitor General to Ken Starr, who was Solicitor General. And then he goes off in private practice. And if any of you remember when he was nominated, it was bandied about that he argued 39 cases before the Supreme Court, both in public and private practice. And should we jump ahead to 2005 when he gets the job? Okay, so here we are. I remember these weeks so well because, okay, so it's July 1st, 2005. I am finishing up the Sandra Day OConnor biography, thinking my deadline's January of 2006, I'm cruising along, and on July 1st, 2005, she announces she's going to retire. At this moment, as I know you remember, and anybody who was sort of watching Supreme Court politics at the time, we all thought Chief Justice Rehnquist would be the one who would leave. He was dying of thyroid cancer. He could hardly speak. He was not spending much time at the court, and everyone thought the next opening was going to be Chief Justice Rehnquist. But Sandra Day OConnor, who was, I think she was only 75 at the time, she was still young in Supreme Court justices' terms, had a husband who was very sick with Alzheimer's, and she decided she had to take care of him. And so she announces her resignation. And, I remember that moment because, but my book's not done, so I had to quickly do that. And here's the interesting thing about John Roberts. John Roberts, at that moment, is on the D.C. circuit, but he's only been there for about 2 years. All the other men, and they were mostly men, almost exclusively men, who he was in competition with, had been on appeals courts much longer. We had Mike Ludig down on the Fourth Circuit. We had Sam Alito on the Third Circuit, J. Harvey Wilkinson on the Fourth Circuit. They had all been around appointees of Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush. And so John Roberts is looking young. In fact, he was just 50 at the time. He's looking young. He's looking not so experienced. And there's some question about how loyal he's going to be to the cause. But it's O'Connor's seat at this moment. And, she's not only the first woman, but she had, in her post-Bush v. Gore world, had moved over a little bit to the center and looked like much more of a centrist jurist than a Ronald Reagan conservative. So there was a lot of politics in the air, and George W. Bush, chooses John Roberts in part because everyone's thinking, well, let's get somebody who isn't as controversial as, for example, Michael Ludig would have been. And, there'll always be the chief seat coming up, everyone's thinking. And he seemed like the safer choice. And not to reinforce the whole idea of networking and, a tight little core group, but a man who had a hand in that was Brett Kavanaugh, who happened to be working for George W. Bush at the time. There are more than just 10 people in the world, but it seems like I'm only mentioning 10, including Ken Starr over and over, who Brett Kavanaugh did work for in many capacities. So George W. Bush clicks with John Roberts, and he decides to nominate him in mid-July 2005 for Sandra Day OConnor's seat. And Sandra Day OConnor has a great line about, I wish it were a woman, but she still liked John Roberts, and there was a certain, symmetry to that because John Roberts had actually helped with her confirmation back in 1981. So what happens then? Chief Justice Rehnquist dies on September 3rd, so we're just within a few weeks. And what else is happening in the country? Again, some of you might not remember, but it was Hurricane Katrina. And the George W. Bush administration was so besieged by complaints about how poorly it had handled the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, people were in the Superdome down in New Orleans. I mean, it was just a disaster. And President Bush had that line, heck of a job, Brownie, to
right.
the FEMA coordinator who was himself underwater in many ways. So when Chief Justice Rehnquist dies, there was some interest among Vice President Cheney perhaps to elevate Scalia. There was interest by some more conservative members of the administration to look to Mike Ludig, or maybe Jay Wilkinson, who was a little bit older and presented much more of an experienced jurist. But George W. Bush wanted no more headaches. I mean, he was just struggling so much with the aftermath of Katrina. John Roberts had presented himself so well with his initial courtesy visits with senators for the Associate Justice job, that they all walk in on Sunday morning. It was, the chief died late on a Saturday night. I remember that moment vividly when I got the call on that too. And, he died late that Saturday night. Sunday morning, President Bush meets with his closest advisors, and the thing he says as they walk in is, "I'm going with John Roberts. You can't talk me into Scalia. You can't talk me into anybody else." It was an easy choice at that moment. And John Roberts, youngest Chief Justice in more than 200 years. Mm-hmm. He was only 50 years old, and here he is 15 years later almost.
How would you evaluate Roberts' performance in the 14 years now that he's been on the court?
I would say it's evolved. When he came in as chief, I remember talking to Justice Scalia saying, Bill Rehnquist had been elevated as chief. He had come on in January of 1972, an appointee of Richard Nixon, and he had spent 14 years as an associate justice, seeing how they all worked together, seeing where the bodies were buried, seeing who was up, who was down, who was petty, who wasn't, who you could work with, who you couldn't. And, so when he became chief in 1986, he sort of knew what was what. And he also he knew what he wanted in the law. So if they weren't going to be with him, he was like, fine, cast your votes, I'm moving on. It was, he had that kind of approach to himself. Now, John Roberts comes in, and he had clerked there in 79-80 for then Associate Justice Bill Rehnquist. He hadn't really managed things. Mm-hmm. The last managerial job he essentially had been at the law review. But, seriously, he had not been a manager. And here he is with 8 people who are appointed for life, who are certain they're the smartest persons in the room. They've been together for 11 years. There hadn't been a change in the Supreme Court since Breyer had come on in 94. So that was tough. He had to figure out how to navigate among a lot of personalities when he was certain he was the smartest person in the room, but they were even, so you had to deal with that. And then, of course, he had, his original mantra was, I want to decide things as narrowly as possible so that we can get as many votes on as possible. But, you just refer to that Carhart case where Sam Alito comes on just a few months later. Sam Alito then gets tapped for the O'Connor vacancy. And that made a huge difference, as Jeff was writing. They have Sandra Day OConnor succeeded by Sam Alito meant a real shift in the law, including on abortion. And there were a lot of 5-4 decisions that John Roberts didn't want to have his court identified with, but those were the breaks.
How does he get along with the other justices?
Well, I think that's been a work in progress. That was one thing that surprised me because he presents. He's in very structured settings. He's got a fabulous sense of timing. He's a wonderful speaker. He projects a real collegiality. And when I was doing interviews, I was surprised at how much tensions there were behind the scenes. And they weren't really just ideological. That there were some people on his side, so to speak, who weren't quite sure if he was an honest broker on things. There was a lot of fallout from his switched votes in the Affordable Care Act case in 2012. With Rehnquist, love him or hate him, what you saw was what you got. Mm-hmm. And with John Roberts, he was trying to figure out, exactly what his hand was. If I was told it once, I was told it a million times. He keeps his cards close to the vest. And so there were tensions. But one thing I have to say is, if you're an outsider and you write about tensions at the court, they close ranks pretty quickly. We love each other, like so. And that's okay. I get that. They're appointed for life, and I'm still here, but I don't have that kind of appointment. So so you're aware of. I became aware of that, and I also became aware of, just as I'm finishing up this book, as you know, books take a long lead time. Justice Kennedy is leaving. Now, Justice Kennedy was in some ways, he's the ideological center. He was the glue for all of them. He was the decider. And now John Roberts, who has a much different sensibility than Anthony Kennedy, he's at the ideological middle. So he's now not just someone who has to figure out how to, how he wants this court to be viewed publicly. He now has even more authority in his vote. So things are changing all the time there. And then you have the pressure from the Trump administration. He's very close to someone who used to teach here, Elena Kagan. He's also, I think, closer to Brett Kavanaugh than he is to Neil Gorsuch, just because he, in the Solicitor General's office back in the H.W. Bush administration, both of them were there. They both were judges on the D.C. Circuit. They run in, even though they're separated by about 10 years, they run in similar crowds, have similar backgrounds. So I think there's a natural compatibility between Justice Kavanaugh and the Chief, not so much with Neil Gorsuch. So, it's like with it has become cliche what Byron White used to say, with every new justice you have a new court, but it's true.
Mm-hmm. How do you think Roberts is likely to lead the court on issues like abortion, affirmative action, gay rights, where Kennedy was the swing vote and he's now gone?
I think that he and the court have become much more unpredictable, in part because the Chief, if he were listening to this, and he won't be, would be thinking, oh, she's so wrong. But I think there's a certain sequencing that happens, that he's not just looking at a single case. He's always kind of stepping back and thinking, what else is happening? What are people seeing? He's very aware of how things might be received. So not only is he looking at the facts of the case, the law of the case, but the moment we're in terms of the law and politics. So, for example, the oral arguments in the DACA, the deferred deportation for childhood arrivals, that was just argued. Going into it, I was very aware that he had been 100% with the Trump administration in Trump versus Hawaii on the travel ban. Super aware of that. I was also aware because I had found out that he had switched his vote in the census case. He at first was with the Trump administration, then changed his vote. I was suspecting, and I knew how he had voted in the DAPA case, the parental arrivals thing in 2016. I knew that he had voted for that. So I knew he would be inclined to want to support the administration. But I was also aware that he's got abortion on the table there. He's got the Title VII gay rights cases there. He'll be presiding presumably over an impeachment trial. He's got a lot of other things going on. Could he possibly be looking for an off-ramp to not give Trump too many 5-4 wins? And again, in some ways that might sound cynical. That might sound, kind of looking at them in a lens that they would prefer not to have them viewed. But I know from experience in dealing with these justices that there are just lots of things at play, and especially for the Chief, because he is aware, and I've found times when he did switch his vote, in part because of what he viewed was, perhaps a legal off-ramp, but also something that would perhaps protect the institution more and his legacy.
I'm going to ask Joan one more question and then open it up to the audience. But so, who's your next justice?
So hard, because I have to tell people that when I pitched writing about John Roberts to the publisher who had done the Justice Scalia book and the Sonia Sotomayor book, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, my editor there, wasn't interested in the Chief. He didn't have a naturally interesting demographic background, this guy from Indiana. And, but I was really interested. I thought, again, as I said at the beginning, only 17 Chief Justices. He's so enigmatic. What is he all about? And, fortunately, in the process of writing this book, he became more relevant because of Kennedy's departure. But it's a heavier lift when you don't have the natural first woman, first Italian-American, first Latina. So I am right now in the process of kind of deciding, is there another individual? Is there a person? Because biography is so much fun, and it's, frankly, as a writer, the narrative is built in. You've got a life so that you can track. But I'm looking a little more broadly this time at some relational things on the court, some of the pressures that the justices are feeling because of an unusual administration, and we don't know what's going to happen in 2020 if President Trump will get another term, or if a new president would put pressure on the court in a different way. We just don't know. And I'm thinking that this court in this era bears watching, and I just have to figure out the right lens. So that's all by way of saying I don't know yet, and I have to choose carefully, because once you choose something and you get a contract, you in some ways remove yourself from life, and you never see any good movies, and none of your friends like you, and your family hates you, and so you have to choose very carefully.
Questions? Oh, come on. Yes, Jerry.
Thank you. This was fascinating.
Thanks.
During the W. Bush years, Congress passed a couple of jurisdictional stripping bills that the court essentially invalidated. Did you have any sense of how Roberts thought about those? These were the 9/11 cases.
Right. Well, it's interesting because the Reagan administration, where he had a core job giving legal advice on that, on court stripping, the idea, just to remind everyone of what I'm sure you know, is that back in the Reagan era, some of the legal teams suggested having the court not get involved in abortion, because we were still very much in a strong Roe v. Wade era. Having the court not get involved in church-state cases. And John Roberts had to write a memo sort of facing off against Ted Olson, another name that comes up all the time, about the validity of court stripping. And what I believe he has always thought is that as a matter of constitutional law, it might be okay. That's back in the day when he was wearing that hat. But as a matter of public policy, you're just sort of asking for trouble, that it's not worth it. And, courts evolve, courts change. And I think, it's a very big question right now how John Roberts will regard the scope of, essentially his jurisdictional mandate, especially relative to the executive branch. All of you, were aware of Attorney General Barr's speech, and his idea of executive authority, which was something that, John Roberts very much believes in, but will he believe in it as strongly at this moment with President Trump in the White House and trying to protect the integrity of the court?
But I'll call on you.
Somebody back there at the microphone.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
When John Roberts is called upon to preside over an impeachment trial, how do you think he'll approach that duty? And especially if there are many senators like Lindsey Graham who are urging simply voting it down without a trial at all, how do you think he'll deal with that problem?
Okay, that's a very relevant question, because the only duty of the Chief Justice that's actually specified in the Constitution is as the person who presides at a Senate trial for impeachment of the president. And I know that his people are studying up on it. He's got his former mentor, William Rehnquist, presided in 1999 over the Bill Clinton trial. And I went and found William Rehnquist's correspondence during that era that's at the Hoover. And I'm sure that people who were part of Rehnquist's team, who happen to still be on the scene now with the current chief, are helping inform him on that role. And it is largely ministerial. He works with the parliament I've gone back and looked at a lot of the transcripts and tried to figure out what kind of role would this current chief want. And this current chief does not want to decide whether whether the president gets convicted or not. I could guarantee you that. So he doesn't want to have to cast any deciding vote. But what he does is he makes the trains run. And the Senate, if the senators themselves will agree on their own rules, and then he will be the enforcer of sorts with the parliamentarian at his hand. Rehnquist was always turning to the parliamentarian saying, this, that kind of thing. So I think, and you might not remember, but there was a motion made by Robert Byrd to dismiss the Clinton impeachment charges from the House. And for that, you only need a majority vote, and he didn't get it. There was enough, Democrats, of course, were in the minority at the time when Bill Clinton was being tried in the Senate. And Senator Byrd, it was kind of an odd motion of his to dismiss these, because he couldn't stand what Clinton had done, but he was just so, on the whole Monica Lewinsky thing, but he just wanted it to all go away, and he felt like the whole thing was devolving into this terrible partisan show, and that motion failed. But then, of course, you need 2/3 to convict, and there was no way they got 2/3. And in fact, that vote showed that there were enough, there was never going to be 2/3 for those charges, and that's what. Conventional wisdom right now is probably right, that there's no way Mitch McConnell, where we're at, and the information that the country now has, and the impeachment inquiry hearings are going on as I speak, but it doesn't look like the Senate will ever be able to come up with 2/3 to convict if the House ends up impeaching. But I think the chief will be careful to keep his role as neutral as possible and as almost pro forma as possible. It's a headache job, actually, for him. The old chief kind of liked it. I don't know if you remember, he was up there with the stripes he had put on his robe, from a Gilbert and Sullivan thing, and he had just written a book called Grand Inquests about impeachments that had come out in 1992. So he was, he was all into it, but he considered it a bit of a hassle because, you're over on the other side of East Capitol, hearing cases in the morning, running over in the afternoons to preside over this trial. And for anybody who's watched the Senate, as you know, they're constantly like delays and all that. And the old chief was always on the clock. So we'll have to see how John Roberts uses his time. But we'll all see. That's the great thing about these impeachment hearings, is that, and the impeachment trial, they will be on TV, whereas the Supreme Court is not on TV.
Right. Yes.
You talked a little bit about how the process of writing the biographies either like new material comes up later, or there's some events that might change the beginnings of the book. Can you talk a little bit about the choice to write living biographies for justices who, as far as we know, may be on the court for 20 years?
That's a great question. And, we've talked about this. Why don't I just do the dead people? It's just so much, it's so much easier. They're not going to come complain, that's for sure. You're not going to have the same issues that I have all the time after these things come out, and then, I have to kind of rebuild these relationships. But you're not going to have, and what material's there. Kind of, it's a really finite project. But I think it comes from the fact that I am still a journalist. And even though I'm not covering the Supreme Court as our main daily journalist, and I haven't done that since I left the Post in USA Today, I've always been now more into projects or analyses. The chase of what's happening now and the relevance of what's happening now, and inevitably, as I'm doing reporting for any of these books, I get great stuff for my day job. That's nice. And I also feel like, why not? The chief, one of the many things the chief said to me, to try to discourage me was, it's too early. I don't want to do it. Wait until I'm dead. And I would say, when you're dead, I'm dead. So forget it. Forget it. That's not how this is going to happen. But many of my conversations with him were off the record. Some materials he put on background that I could use. So I'm only telling you what, mainly what I was telling to him is that, look at how important he is. And he's only gotten more important. And so that does mean it makes it more exciting for me, but it also makes it limited. Now, I really felt like my O'Connor book held up for many years. And the one that came out now is, essentially 14 years later and has, now can fully assess with many more documentation pieces that are available, kind of the entire O'Connor what O'Connor represented to the country in a way that when I did it right as she was leaving was different. And I don't think other people have done Scalia books, but Scalia in 2009, even though he hung in there until obviously 2016, most of his world, most of what I would have wanted to say, I had in hand, because his young life was so intriguing. And with the chief, many people have said to me exactly what you said, like there'll be so much more and things will change. And I was so aware of, just when I was facing deadlines, is Anthony Kennedy going to stay? Is he going to go? And then, I remember in November of 2018 was when John Roberts had that line about there are no Obama judges, Trump judges, whatever, we just have these neutral people. And I was begging that into the final galleys with the editor. And my editor said, this is not a newspaper. This is a book. This is a book. You have to cut it off. But and for that one, I hung up that phone and I called the production manager. Hey, how about trying to get, I was constantly treating it like, something that you wanted the freshest stuff in there. And I was glad that I was able to, get those in. But I think it's the nature of the kind of work I do. And, probably, the law professors here who have much more of a historian's eye would want to wait. And maybe I'll eventually do that down the road. But for now, it's kind of fun as it's working. And I also feel like it's meaningful. It's meaningful.
Yes.
You touched on this, but could you talk more about how Chief Justice Roberts sees his role protecting the integrity of the court and how that might come into play in the court's called upon to really reconsider some of the protection, for example, in regards to abortion?
That's right. A question I get often is, what will we do on Roe v. Wade? Now, at this point, he has never voted against an abortion regulation in any case during his time. So that's a touchstone for me. But then look what happened in February of this year, 2020, when the Louisiana abortion law was about to go into effect. And it's very similar to one from Texas that had been struck down with John Roberts in dissent, but yet the Supreme Court had struck it down in 2016. John Roberts cast the fifth vote with the 4 liberals to block that law from taking effect. Now, if Anthony Kennedy had still been on the court, if something else was happening, I just wonder if he would have cast that vote. In fact, I don't think he would have. I don't think he would have needed to. He probably would have not wanted to, but we will soon see what he does because the Louisiana abortion regulation is now going to be heard on the merits this court term. It's the June medical case. Right. So for all these things, what I'm seeing are new data points. I think that John Roberts still very much would quarrel with Roe v. Wade and with the 1992 Casey decision that reinforced that. But does he want to be presiding over a court that reverses this landmark that's now nearly, half a century old? Will he do that, especially when everyone's looking at this court as being more political? And he's out there saying defiantly, we are not political. So I think that's all in the mix. I think the one area that as Jeff knows, that I said in the book where I don't think he will have qualms is I think on race, he still very much thinks that affirmative action and any racial remedies are bad. And he, had completely owned his Shelby County versus Holder decision, his decision in Parents Involved, that Justice Kennedy did not join, where he sort of reinterpreted Brown v. Board of Education, still really stands out as something that has a decision that very much is against any kind of racial remedy. And a clash he had with Sonia Sotomayor was over, do those kinds of programs do more harm than good? And he is adamant, has always been adamant that they do more harm than good. And the Harvard affirmative action case is marching its way up there. So I think on something like that, he will be more predictable just because of where he's been. But on issues of reproductive rights, there might be more play in the joints. And I think on issues involving President Trump and perhaps the tax cases that are up there now, would he reject what Judge Bob Katzmann wrote in the Second Circuit, hanging the Trump idea that he can't even be investigated at all while he's president, not just indicted, but investigated at all. And would John Roberts reject the notion that U.S. v. Nixon doesn't allow that? So I think there are just so many different issues on executive power that he might step back from in a certain way that he wouldn't if times were different. And I just to let you know what I was talking about, probably most of you know, there are 2 Trump tax cases that have now hit the Supreme Court. One comes from the Second Circuit, and it was an opinion by Judge Katzmann for a 3-judge panel rejecting the Trump arguments that a sitting president is immune from any kind of criminal proceeding while he's in office. And then the other one involves the powers of the House to have oversight and over, again, trying to obtain financial documents from a president.
Last question. What was Chief Justice Roberts' reaction to your book?
That's off the record. Sorry. He has said things to other reporters that they all scurried back and told me about in various ways. I would just say that from what I know from others, not from my own personal experience, was that he still would prefer that it was not written. Until we're both dead. One of us before the other, maybe.
I should say I highly recommend it. It's a really fascinating, well-written, and engaging book, and you learn a lot about the nature of the Supreme Court as an institution, about the nature of the executive branch, how these decisions get made. So I highly recommend the book. It's a terrific read.
Well, and one thing I was going to say, people in his family, like I hear from like, the poor guy, people keep going up to him asking him to sign it, which I'm sure is not fun at all. But I also, or they say, I'm going to ask him to sign it kind of thing. But I have heard from relatives of his who want copies and all that. So, it's, when you're the subject of anything, as we all know, whether it be the wrath of Scalia or a biography, you want things to go exactly your way.
Right. And it's not, by the way, I mean, when I read it, I didn't perceive it as sort of harshly critical of Roberts. I mean, there are pieces where you, I think, quite sensibly criticize him the way you would criticize anybody for various activities, but apparently it's been taken the wrong way. Thank you all very much. Thank Joan Biskupic.
Thank you.